Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel and stay updated on more historical stories. The Tehran Conference was one of the most important diplomatic meetings of the Second World War. It took place from November 28th to December 1st, 1943, in the capital of Iran, the historic city of Tehran. During this meeting, the leaders of the three most powerful Allied nations gathered for the first time to coordinate their strategy against Nazi Germany and to discuss what the world might look like after the war. These three leaders were Franklin D. Roosevelt, the President of the United States, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. Their meeting in Tehran marked a turning point in World War II, as it helped shape the final strategy that would ultimately defeat Hitler's regime. By 1943, the war had already devastated much of Europe and Asia. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died, entire cities had been destroyed, and the conflict had spread across continents. In the early years of the war, the forces of Adolf Hitler had achieved stunning victories. German armies conquered large parts of Europe, including France, Belgium, Netherlands, and many other countries. In 1941, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, opening the largest land front in the history of warfare. For a time, it seemed that Nazi Germany might dominate the entire European continent. However, the situation began to change dramatically by 1943. The German army suffered a devastating defeat in the Battle of Stalingrad, where Soviet forces surrounded and destroyed an entire German army. This battle marked the beginning of a powerful Soviet counteroffensive that pushed German troops westward. At the same time, Allied forces from the United States and the United Kingdom were increasing their military pressure. They had already invaded Italy and were bombing German cities on a massive scale. Although the Allies were gaining strength, victory was still far from certain, and coordination between the major Allied powers became more important than ever. One of the biggest issues facing the Allied leaders was the question of opening a second front in Western Europe. Since 1941, the Soviet Union had been fighting the majority of German forces on the Eastern Front. Soviet soldiers were suffering enormous casualties while holding back the German advance. Joseph Stalin repeatedly demanded that the Western Allies invade German-occupied Europe in order to force Germany to divide its forces. However, Winston Churchill and many Allied military planners believed that such an invasion required careful preparation and could not happen until the Allies had built up enough troops, ships, and equipment. For several years, the Soviet Union remained frustrated by these delays. Stalin suspected that the Western powers were intentionally postponing the invasion while the Soviet Union bore the heaviest burden of the war. This suspicion created tension within the Allied alliance. By 1943, it became clear that a direct meeting between the leaders was necessary to coordinate their plans and restore trust. Choosing a location for the meeting was complicated. Joseph Stalin rarely traveled outside the Soviet Union, especially during wartime. He insisted that the conference be held somewhere close to Soviet territory. After many discussions, the Allied leaders agreed to meet in Tehran, which was under Allied control at the time. In 1941, British and Soviet forces had entered Iran to secure vital oil supplies and to establish a supply route that delivered American weapons and equipment to the Soviet Union. This route became known as the Persian Corridor and played a critical role in supporting Soviet war efforts. Security for the conference was extremely tight. German intelligence networks operated across the Middle East, and there were fears that the Nazi regime might attempt to assassinate the Allied leaders. According to some reports, German agents planned a secret mission called Operation Long Jump, which aimed to kill Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin during the conference. Historians still debate whether this operation was real or exaggerated, but Allied security forces took the threat very seriously. Thousands of soldiers guarded the city, and strict secrecy surrounded the leaders' travel plans. When the conference began in late November 1943, the atmosphere was both tense and historic. For the first time, the three leaders met face-to-face to discuss the future of the war. Franklin D. Roosevelt played an important diplomatic role during the meetings. He believed that maintaining a strong partnership with the Soviet Union was essential for defeating Germany and maintaining peace after the war. Roosevelt even chose to stay inside the Soviet embassy compound during the conference, allowing him to meet frequently with Stalin in a more informal setting. One of the most important decisions made during the Tehran Conference was the confirmation of a massive Allied invasion of Western Europe. This operation would later become known as Operation Overlord. The plan called for Allied forces to cross the English Channel and land on the beaches of Normandy in northern France. It would involve thousands of ships, aircraft, and landing craft carrying millions of soldiers. The scale of the operation was unprecedented in military history. Stalin welcomed the decision enthusiastically because it meant that Germany would soon face a second major front in the war. The Soviet Union also promised to coordinate its military offensives with the Allied invasion. Soviet armies would launch powerful attacks in Eastern Europe at the same time that Western Allied forces invaded France. This strategy would force Germany to fight on two massive fronts simultaneously, making it almost impossible for Hitler to concentrate his forces. Another important discussion during the conference concerned the war against Japan. At the time, the United States was engaged in a brutal struggle across the Pacific Ocean. Roosevelt asked Stalin whether the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan after Germany was defeated. Stalin agreed and promised that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan at the appropriate time. This promise later played a major role in the final defeat of Japan in 1945. Beyond military planning, the leaders also discussed the future political map of Europe. The defeat of Nazi Germany would leave a huge power vacuum across the continent. One of the most difficult issues was the future of Germany itself. The Allied leaders agreed that Germany must never again be able to start a global war. Some proposals suggested dividing Germany into smaller states or placing it under international control. Although no final decision was reached in Tehran, these discussions laid the groundwork for later negotiations. The future borders of Poland also became a sensitive topic. Poland had been the first country invaded by Nazi Germany in 1939, an event that triggered the beginning of World War II. By 1943, Soviet armies were advancing into Polish territory, and Stalin insisted that Poland's eastern border should move westward. This would allow the Soviet Union to keep territories it had occupied earlier in the war. Churchill and Roosevelt were cautious about this proposal because it could anger the Polish government in exile and create political tension in post-war Europe. Despite these disagreements, the conference generally maintained a cooperative atmosphere. The leaders attended official dinners together and sometimes joked or debated passionately about the future. Churchill, known for his dramatic personality, often used humor and speeches to influence the discussions. Stalin was more reserved but occasionally displayed a dry sense of humor. Roosevelt acted as a mediator between the two, trying to keep the alliance united. During one famous dinner conversation, Stalin reportedly joked that tens of thousands of German officers should be executed after the war to prevent Germany from starting another conflict. Churchill reacted strongly against the idea, arguing that such actions would violate the principles for which the Allies were fighting. Roosevelt attempted to ease the tension by turning the moment into a light-hearted remark, illustrating how delicate the political balance between the leaders could be. The Tehran Conference ended on December 1st, 1943. The three leaders issued a joint declaration stating that their nations were united in their determination to defeat Nazi Germany. They also expressed hope that their cooperation would lead to lasting peace once the war ended. The agreements made in Tehran soon began to shape the course of the war. In June 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, landing on the beaches of Normandy in what became known as D-Day. At the same time, Soviet forces launched massive offensives across Eastern Europe, pushing German armies steadily toward Berlin. The pressure from both fronts gradually overwhelmed Nazi Germany's military power. Less than 2 years after the Tehran meeting, Germany surrendered in May 1945. The Allied strategy discussed in Tehran had played a major role in achieving that victory. However, the conference also revealed deep political differences between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. These tensions would grow stronger after the war, and eventually lead to the geopolitical rivalry known as the Cold War. Despite those later conflicts, the Tehran Conference remains one of the most important diplomatic meetings of the 20th century. It brought together the leaders of the most powerful Allied nations at a critical moment in history. Their decisions helped determine the strategy that defeated Nazi Germany and reshaped the political landscape of Europe and the world. The conference demonstrated both the strength of international cooperation in times of crisis and the challenges of balancing competing political interests in the pursuit of peace.